A Rose for Emily is a short story written by William Faulkner in 1930. It's considered to be a work of Southern Gothic literature, which means that the text concerns itself with the moral, economic, and social decay of post-war Southern culture. When I say post-war, I'm specifically referring to the period following Reconstruction, following the Civil War, hence the term post-war. In the South, we're seeing a radical change in not only power structures, but economic ones as well. The Southern economy is forced to modernize as the traditional agrarian models are abandoned, paving the way for industrial change and massive turnovers of wealth. I introduced the topic this way because our reading of A Rose for Emily requires some degree of understanding on the matters of wealth, class, and economy. This is because we're subjecting this week's reading to Marxist criticism, which is a theory based on the economic theories of Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels. Soon we're going to be referring to the Portraits and Criticism handout for a quick description of the theory in Marx's own words. Before I read from the handout, though, we have to consider the time period in which this theory was founded. In the 1840s, a number of revolutionary upheavals took place throughout Europe, and European economies began to modernize as industrialization took root. With industrialization came the rise of urbanization, and with that came the decline of the living conditions of the working poor. These factors, along with the peasant revolt in Galicia, weighed heavily on the mind of Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels as they wrote their Communist Manifesto in 1848, where they famously stated that the history of all hitherto existing society is the history of class struggles. Therefore, and now I lead into the handout, Marxist literary criticism raises the following questions. How is the working class represented in art and literature? And what structures are put in place to perpetuate economic roles? In the following passage from Das Kapital, Volume 1, Marx argues that the bourgeoisie not only dehumanizes workers by stripping them of their natural rights and transforming them into mere tools for the production of commodities, but also, by monopolizing their work week, prevent them from ever ascending the social hierarchy. It is self-evident that the laborer is nothing else his whole life through than labor power, that therefore all his disposable time is by nature and law labor time, to be devoted to the self-expansion of capital, time for education, for intellectual development, for the fulfilling of social functions and for social intercourse, for the free play of his bodily and mental activity, even the rest time of Sunday, and that in a country of Sabbatarians. Capital cares nothing for the length of life of labor power. All that concerns it is simply and solely the maximum of labor power that can be rendered fluent in a working day. It attains this end by shortening the extent of the laborer's life, as a greedy farmer snatches increased produce from the soil by robbing it of its fertility. Continuing on with the handout, Marxist criticism is rooted in the theory that an author's ideals and worldview are shaped by their reaction to their social standing. As Marx states in his preface to A Contribution to the Critique of Political Economy, it is not the consciousness of men that determines their being, but, on the contrary, their social being that determines their consciousness. The Marxist critic searches for examples of classism, abuse of social privilege, and economic inequality in a work of literature, and also for the symbols, ideologies, and power structures that reinforce the authority of capitalist economic models. So we'll segue back into our discussion on A Rose for Emily by affirming that, in the story, we'll see clear divisions of wealth and class taking place, clear divisions between old wealth and new wealth, between the working class and moneyed elites. As you read A Rose for Emily, ask yourself this: who are the economically privileged classes, and how are they treated differently? A Rose for Emily picks up in medias res, which means in the middle of things. The titular character Emily has already passed on, and we're reading the story in past tense, knowing that the events have occurred some time before the narration begins. The story that follows is a rather disconnected series of snapshots of Emily's life. Small but significant fragments, and you should notice right away that the narrator of the story is not an I, but a we. We can infer that the narrator is representative of the community as a whole, a community that has for many years watched Emily, orbiting around her in their suspended intrigue, and silently judging her every move. Emily, for her part, invites suspicion because she is intentionally reclusive. She comes from a wealthy, upper-class background, from a family with powerful connections to the town. It's understood that throughout her entire life she was forced to live in a manner that measured up to her father's high expectations of her social status. Any attempts by Emily at having intimate relationships are challenged and ultimately rejected by her father because he doesn't view any of her suitors as good enough for her. She's emotionally and financially dependent on him. This carries on until her father dies, after which point she retreats into her home and isn't often seen venturing outside. After a certain point, in fact, she doesn't even seem to be aware of the current events in town. One of the first memories the narrator discloses involves Emily's violation of a tax notice. Colonel Sartoris, the former mayor of the town, had waived Emily's tax responsibilities after the death of her father, but Emily is apparently unaware that Sartoris has passed away and that the current officials are not honoring his agreement. Confronted on her doorstep with a tax notice, Emily coldly says, "I have no taxes" in Jefferson. Emily's detachment with the modernizing world is a recurring theme in A Rose for Emily, and indeed is indicative of something greater. You see, Southern Gothic literature concerns itself with the changing infrastructures of post-war Southern society. The old elite, which is symbolized by the character of Emily, is fading away. The narrator says on page 308, "Only Emily's house was left, lifting its stubborn and coquettish decay above the cotton wagons and the gasoline pumps." He continues on 309, "Miss Emily had been a tradition, a duty, and a care, a sort of hereditary obligation upon the town." As the traditional class structure recedes, it gives way to new opportunities and prospectors. So if Emily and her family represent the old money elite, there must be a foil to this archetype. This is where we encounter the character Homer Barron, a contractor whom Emily takes a liking to. As a northerner, he is viewed with some degree of suspicion by the town. He already has that working against him, but to make matters worse, the community sees him as little more than a common laborer, one who is beneath Emily. Some members of the community even regard Emily's indulging of Barron as noblesse oblige, which is the concept that those in higher social spheres should be kind and courteous to the underclasses. They just couldn't conceive the notion that Emily actually could fall in love with this day laborer. Whether or not Emily, with her dusty, decrepit home, deserves to be considered a part of the upper class is of little importance to us. The fact is that the town considers her to be a member of the old elite, and this factors into the way that she's expected to act. She knows from her father's old instruction that she can't step beneath her social sphere to marry Homer Barron. To revisit the words of Karl Marx, it is not the consciousness of men and women that determines their being, but, on the contrary, their social being that determines their consciousness. In other words, the way that Emily acts and the way that she can be seen acting is all informed by her upper-class upbringing. She exists, in a way, for no other reason than to fulfill this archetype, a specter of the old elite. And she does so stubbornly and pridefully. But it's also abundantly clear that she has fallen in love with Barron and cannot stand the idea of losing him. So what does she do? Well, how she negotiates this balance will be for you to discover in your own reading. The final revelation, however, will paint a far different picture of Emily from what you might be expecting. As we wrap up this discussion, I want you to reconsider what I had asked earlier in the presentation. Who are the economically privileged classes in A Rose for Emily, and how are they treated differently? And I'd like you to consider that question in light of the character Toby, Emily's servant. It's important to note that Marxist theory is not blind to the economic plight of African Americans in post-Reconstruction era America. A Rose for Emily, after all, occurs in a time period that overlaps with Jim Crow and segregation laws. So what is Toby's role in the class system in A Rose for Emily? And perhaps to open the discussion even more, consider what Emily's relationship to Toby is like. Does she treat him fairly? Is she in some way dependent on him, he on her? Before I sign off, I want to introduce you to an important vocabulary term which we'll be revisiting throughout the semester. The term is verisimilitude, and it refers to the way that a text portrays details in a realistic way so as to engage our senses of sight, smell, touch, taste, and sound. Verisimilitude is the action of creating a work of art that is authentic and invites the reader into the artificial world that is constructed by the story. When the narrator on page 309 says that after opening the blinds on a window, a faint dust rose sluggishly about their thighs, spinning with slow motes in the single sunray, we can imagine this description quite vividly in our mind's eye. Another instance of verisimilitude occurs on page 315 when the narrator describes dust as acrid or bitter tasting, which actually engages the dual senses of taste and smell. Dust seems to lie all about Emily's house. What might that symbolize? Think about that as you read through the text this week. So with that, I'm going to conclude this week's presentation on A Rose for Emily.